I want to talk to you about Bilderberger sister organization. And so, in kind of a conventional teleplay, there are actually secret spin off organizations similar to the Bilderberg Group. And the largest is called the Round Table, whose branches include, for example, Britain's Royal Institute of International Affairs, Institute of International Affairs of Canada, also Australia, South Africa, India, Holland, as well as others, for example, Institute of Pacific Relations for China and Russia and Japan. And one of the Roundtable's branches in the United States is called Council on Foreign Relations, or CFR for short. Part of the origins of the CFR go back to 1921. One of its founders, Edward Mandell House, was President Woodrow Wilson's chief advisor and also rumored to be the power behind Wilson administration from 1913 to 1921. And under his watch in the White House, Edward Mandell House, remember that name, lobbied for a state-sponsored central bank empowered to make American money. In 1913, the United States Congress still at the time controlled the country's currency, but at the end of that year, passage of the Federal Reserve Act transferred Congress's power to a private central bank. He also proposed the 16th Amendment to the United States Constitution, which introduced the graduated income tax. So Edward Mandell House also wrote the plan for the League of Nations, which was President Wilson's prize proposal of the 1919 Paris Peace Conference. At the end of Wilson's term in 1921, House and like-minded sympathizers, well, they established the Council on Foreign Relations. And from the outset, from the very beginning, their commitment to form a kind of a government based on a centralized global financing system attracted the strangest mix of capitalists and socialists, opportunists, and also idealists. And among the potpourri of America's elitists at that first meeting, needless to say, were the rich and the powerful. And so within a year, the Rockefeller Foundation and Carnegie Foundation, they agreed to finance the CFR's agenda and also its growth. And President Franklin Roosevelt is responsible for filling the State Department with CFR members in 1940, and subsequent generations and generations of CFR place staff have run the events ever since. Now, the CFR is headquartered in New York at the Harold Pratt House, which is a four-story mansion on the corner of Park Avenue and 60th Street. And if you live in the United States, if you live in New York, you actually go by and see this beautiful building, and also part of the legacy of what the United States secret societies are all about. And the widow of the heir to the Standard Oil Rockefeller fortune, Charles Pratt, donated the building for its use for the Council on Foreign Relations back in 1929. Now, in the year 2006, over 4,000 of America's leading establishment were also members of the CFR. And although the Council on Foreign Relations is very influential in government, it remains off the radar screen for most Americans. Now, so when asked this question many years ago, CFR member Katharine Graham, the legendary Washington Post publisher, well, she basically told the audience, there are some things the general public does not need to know about us and shouldn't. Point taken. And so historian Arthur Schlesinger Jr. has called the Council on Foreign Relations a kind of a front organizations for the hearts of the American establishment. Newsweek has referred to CFR's leaders as the foreign policy establishment of the United States. Richard Grover, writing for the Esquire magazine, saw them as a kind of sort of presidium, he said, for that part of the establishment that guides our destiny as a nation. And so the 200 plus journalists, correspondents, communicator executives who belong to the CFR defend the group's right to privacy discussions on the basis of a supposed need for a forum where concerned leaders can speak freely to analyze critical events affecting American foreign policy, American political directions, and also in the world economy. There to have, as I said, any hope of developing solutions and our policies for America's better future. And so once these solutions and policies are announced, then the Council on Foreign Relations welcomes press coverage and also press debate. However, when any organization does not tolerate open publications of their discussions and activity, well, we have to wonder at the information we are provided by this organization. There is another coexisting organization with the same global objective, except its members represent global trade alliances, North America, Western Europe, and Pacific Asia. And it's called the Trilateral Commission, and it was founded and financed by David Rockefeller back in 1973. And so many of the same individuals who belong to the CFR and to the Bilderbergers also joined the Trilateral Commission. And so CFR members comprise Americans only. The Bilderberger group is limited to the members from the United States, from Canada, and Western Europe. And the Trilateral Commission brings together global power brokers, as I will discuss in later episodes. And David Rockefeller, whose family financed the CFR, is a common denominator among these parallel groups. Not only is he, the CFR was at the time, the CFR chairman emeritus, but he also continued until his death to provide financial and also personal support to the Trilateral Commission, to Council on Foreign Relations, and to the Bilderberg Group. And so it's no wonder then that critics see these three organizations kind of comprising self-interested elitists protecting their wealth and the investments of these multinational banks and corporations in the growing world economy at the expense of the developing nations, third world countries, etc. And the policies they develop benefit them as well as move us towards a global government. And so to appreciate the extent of power of the Bilderbergers and Council on Foreign Relations and the Trilateral Commission, it's enough to recall that almost all of the presidential candidates for both parties in the United States, the Republicans and the Democrats, have belonged to at least one of these organizations. Many of the US congressmen, senators, most major policy-making positions, especially in the field of foreign relations, much of the press, most of the leadership of the CIA, the FBI, Internal Revenue Service, and many of the remaining governmental organizations in Washington, CFR members occupy nearly all White House cabinet positions. For example, of the CIA directors, only James Schlesinger, who briefly headed the CIA in 1973, was not a CFR member. He was, however, a protege of CFR member Daniel Ellsberg, famous for the release of the Vietnam-era Pentagon Papers, and his appointment was approved by Henry Kissinger, key Bilderberger CFR and Trilateral Commission leader. Of the US presidents, for example, we have seen a string of CFR members winning the elections every 4 years. Let's go back to the beginning, post-World War II. Again, remember, Bilderberger was founded in 1954. So in 1952 and 1956, CFR Adlai Stevenson challenged CFR member Eisenhower. In 1960, it was the CFR member Nixon versus the CFR member Kennedy. In 1964, the conservative wing of the Republican Party stunned the establishment by nominating its candidate, Barry Goldwater, over Nelson Rockefeller. And Rockefeller and the CFR wing portrayed Barry Goldwater as a kind of dangerous radical who would abolish Social Security, drop atom bombs on Hanoi, and in general be a reincarnation of the fascist dictator Mussolini. Needless to say, Goldwater was humiliated and Johnson won in a landslide. And then in 1968, it was CFR member Nixon's turn against CFR Democrat Hubert Humphrey. In 1972, it was CFR President Nixon who took on the CFR Democratic challenger George McGovern. In 1976, it was CFR Republican President Gerald Ford who opposed the CFR Trilateral Commission challenger Jimmy Carter. In 1980, President Carter was defeated by Ronald Reagan. He, although was not a member of the CFR, he had in George H.W. Bush a CFR vice president. And Reagan, after becoming president, quickly staffed his office with 313 CFR members. It's kind of an interesting side note. The independent third-party candidate in the 1980 elections, John Anderson, was also a CFR member. And then in 1984, we have President Reagan contested Democratic CFR member Walter Mondale. In 1988, we had Republican contender for the office of the President of the United States, George H.W. Bush, ex-CIA boss and CFR member, who took on Michael Dukakis, the little-known CFR governor of Massachusetts. And then in 1992, President Bush faced an obscure governor from a backward state of Arkansas as his competitor for the presidency. This was Bill Clinton, a Bilderberger, as well as member of the CFR and the Trilateral Commission. And when Clinton became president, he employed almost 100 members in his administration. And furthermore, the team of Clinton and Al Gore was financed and supported by CFR membership and their agenda. And then in 1996, Clinton fought off a challenge from a Republican veteran and another CFR member, Robert Dole. And in the year 2000, CFR Democrat Al Gore squared off against Texas Governor George W. Bush, son of the former President George H.W. Bush. Now, George W. Bush, who was not a CFR member, but as always is the case, he was surrounded by the establishment in the corridors of power. For example, Bush's insider team included Condoleezza Rice, Dick Cheney, Richard Pearl, Paul Wolfowitz, Louis Libby, Colin Powell, Robert Zoellick, all CFR members. And then in 2004, incumbent Bush won against CFR and Bilderberger challenger Democrat John Kerry. If we go back, way back in time, from 1928 to 1972, a CFR member has won every presidential elections except Lyndon Johnson, who more than compensated the establishment by filling most of his top positions in the government with CFR members. For example, George H.W. Bush had 387 members of the CFR, Council on Foreign Relations, Trilateral Commission, and Bilderberger members in his administration. Nixon, at the beginning of his administration, placed 115 CFR members, that's going back to 1968, in key positions in the executive branch. Of the first 82 names on the list prepared to help President Kennedy staff his State Department, 63 belonged, in fact, to the Council on Foreign Relations. Indeed, the CFR has served as a kind of virtual employment agency for the federal government under both the Democrats and the Republicans. George Wallace, an American Democratic presidential candidate on 4 occasions back in the 1960s and also in the 1970s, made famous a slogan, "There's not a dime's worth of difference between the Democrats and the Republican parties," and he was absolutely right. Governmental policies never seem to change, even though significant, supposedly philosophical differences have taken place within the ruling government itself. And the reason for this is that while grassroots Democrats and Republicans generally have greatly differing views on the economy and political policies and federal activities, as you begin to climb this ladder to the top of this political pyramid, the two parties become more and more alike. And so whether it's a Democrat, a Republican, conservative, or liberal, doesn't matter who's in power, the opposing rhetorics spouted by the candidates apparently have very little to do with who actually wins the elections, because the decision makers who pull the strings from behind the scene, they stay the same. Because again, cabinet seats always held by the Council on Foreign Relations members, Trilateral Commission members, or members of the Bilderberg Group, or in some individuals, such as, for example, Henry Kissinger, who belonged to 3 of these powerful private organizations. So even as, again, US presidents come and go, the CFR power and agenda remains the same, even though we don't hear much about it in the mainstream media. And of course, the average voter is no fool. The public realizes something is amiss. Political survey, trust survey illustrate a growing perception that nothing changes in government no matter how you vote. And this widespread observation has led to a reduced voter turnouts, as we have seen in every election in the United States, and not only in the United States, in Canada, in England, in Europe, in general, in the Western world. And so, for example, in his book, The Future of Federalism, Nelson Rockefeller proclaimed, "No nation today can defend its freedom or fulfill the needs and aspirations of its own people from within its own borders or through its own resources alone." And so the nation state standing alone threatens in many ways to seem as kind of an anachronism, as the Greek city-states eventually became in ancient times. And of course, I think Rockefeller might have been referring to the wrong-headed strategic policies under Pericles and Alcibiades, which got Athens into this disastrous Peloponnesian War that brought on the collapse and self-ruin in the Golden Age. And these stratagems are easily comparable to the current US foreign policy in its calamitous advance. In fact, you really analyze it, the Council on Foreign Relations was apparently planning the New World Order before 1942. We're talking about the second year of World War II, and they're already planning the world post-world global order. For example, an editorial on page 2 in the Baltimore News Post, Monday, December 8, 1941, we're talking about the day after Pearl Harbor was bombed, predicted that there would be a new world league which would formulate, as they say, a basic declaration of the rights of man. And to protect those rights, this system will have the power to deal and also punish individuals in some cases. Furthermore, the United Nations began with a group of CFR members called the Informal Agenda Group, and they drafted the original proposal for the United Nations and called in three CFR attorneys who declared it was absolutely constitutional. They then presented the proposal to President Roosevelt, who announced it the very next day to the public. And so when the United Nations held its founding conference in San Francisco, more than 40 of the American delegates were CFR members, and later the United Nations did adopt a Declaration of Human Rights. Again, back in 1941, Quincy Wright, PhD, a CFR member and a specialist in international law at the University of Chicago, made the earliest and clearest statement on how he viewed the new world order, one government over the entire world. And so in discussing Dr. Wright's ideas in his lectures on the new world order, Terry Boardman told a packed auditorium at Rudolf Steiner House in London in October 1998 that Wright basically envisioned three continental systems: a United States of Europe, an Asiatic system, and also Pan-American Union. And so in a letter to an associate on November 21st, 1933, President Franklin Roosevelt wrote, "The real truth of the matter is, as you and I know, that a financial element in the large center has owned the government over since the days of Andrew Jackson." And so if this is their ultimate goal, to create a single globalized marketplace financially regulated by a World Bank through a global digital currency, as we're seeing right now, then we can ill afford to ignore what is happening to us and the world we live in.